So Hannah has been the MP for the Livingston constituency since she was first elected in 2015 and is the SNP's Westminster spokesperson for consular affairs and international engagement. Before becoming an MP, Hannah worked in commercial television with STV Glasgow and GMTV, as well as working in the US State Department in the Edinburgh Consulate and the energy industry in Aberdeen. So good morning, Hannah. Hello.
Good morning. Pleasure to be with you all. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Hannah. So before we dive into our questions, I'd just like to give a big thanks to charity people for their support in helping us organise and promote this event. They're a lovely organisation which aims to help charities recruit more effectively, efficiently and inclusively. They're often recruiting people to trustee boards as well, so if that's something you're considering, then do chat to them. And also thanks to Greater Manchester Chamber of Commerce, who've just joined us to help support as well. We're really grateful for them supporting what we're trying to do. So yeah, just to sort of kick things off, Hannah, it'd be great to hear just a little bit about, we've heard a little potted history of your incredibly impressive political and commercial career there, but what was life before then? Could you give us a bit of backstory about you and kind of growing up and all that?
Yeah, I'll try and be as brief as possible because I'm conscious of time and that we get to have as much discussion as possible. So I'm Hannah Bardell, as Matt said, the Member of Parliament for Livingston constituency. My pronouns are she, her. And I grew up in my constituency, which doesn't make me a better parliamentarian. It's just a different experience, perhaps, from those who've moved to an area and then become the representative. It means you're often supporting and helping people who you grew up with. So it's a particularly special privilege for me. My mum had my reason for getting into politics really was having grown up in a single parent family. My mum and my brother, my mum brought us up on her own, and she had a real history of local community activism, trying to save schools, being on the board of local organisations, and she actually stood for the seat in 2010, unsuccessfully, sadly, but it did mean in 2015 I got to beat the older straight white man that had beaten her. So that was quite pleasing, shall we say. But for me, I came out when I got elected. So I suppose, I don't know if I meet the threshold for late life lesbian, but I was 32. And I had lived, a big chunk of my life in the closet, so to speak. And I guess it's something that's still, it's less painful now, but was something that I have grieved for, a life that could have been lived differently up until that point. And I've often reflected on why. I'm not sure I've quite got to the bottom of that, but I think part of it was to do with the era that I grew up on in the 80s, Thatcher, who was demonising single parent families, telling people, single mothers, that they should be locked up, essentially. And also Section 28, of course, and the kind of stuff that was pumped out through the media. And I already felt different because I was in a single parent family and I didn't want to be more different. I think that ultimately what it boils down to. And, throughout my career in different sectors, I think probably particularly in the energy sector, I found quite a lot of discrimination and homophobia and lesbophobia, directed and just in everyday life towards the LGBTQ plus community. And so that probably compounded things. And then when I finally decided to stand for election, and I worked for the former First Minister as well in the northeast of Scotland, so I spent 3 years working for him, and then I came back to Edinburgh to work for the American Consulate, and then I went back to the northeast and worked in the energy industry. So I had fairly close contact with politics and left it for 5 years because I knew I wanted to do other things before I even contemplated standing, if that was ever something I wanted to do. And I guess I felt ultimately, if I can't be open and honest with myself as a politician, how can I represent people? And so I think perhaps my, standing for election was a catalyst to coming out, and it so happened that I around the same time got involved with a woman and came to that realization. So it was a strange one because I was going through a lot of personal, I could say turmoil, but challenges at exactly the same time of that very historic election. So there was a lot of emotion for me and there was a lot of just stuff going on. And I decided not to say anything straight away because I felt like I didn't want it to be the first thing I said about myself as I got elected. I waited until the following February, and Chris Bryant was really supportive, particularly, and he did a photograph of queers and peers, they called it, and I took part in that. And I had lots of advice from people, everything from, go on the Lorraine Kelly show to sit down with the Daily Mail because they'll do a story anyway. And it was all just really overwhelming. And I thought, no, I want to establish myself as a politician first because, I am an open and proud lesbian, but it's not the only thing about me. And so, yeah, when I did that, it felt very natural. Although my local paper did have the headline, "Local MP comes out as gay." I mean, that was literally the headline, which I've still got somewhere in the archives. But yeah, it felt by then a very natural thing to do, and I wanted to, I questioned whether I needed to say anything, whether we were at that point where, do you need to come out? And I think since 2015, we've come a long way, although it sometimes feels like one step forward, two steps back, particularly around trans and non-binary equality at the moment. And I'm sure we'll discuss that. But yeah, I felt that as the daughter of a single mother from a working class background who's a lesbian, it was important for me to be open about who I was and use my platform and the huge privilege that I have to support others at home and abroad in our community. So that's a kind of potted history, I think, Matt.
Yeah, that's really good. Thank you. And that you're certainly not alone in that. Many of the leaders we speak to talk about getting to a place in their career, either sort of physically or kind of emotionally, where they feel safe to kind of take that step to come out, and that is often later in life for the people that we speak to. I mean, do you feel like that was an influence in terms of entering politics? Did politics feel like a safer space for you to be yourself, and was that an influence in kind of entering into it?
Yeah, I think it was in some respects because we were in quite a unique position at that point. Both, I think in that election, or maybe the election afterwards, it's hard to remember because there's been a lot of elections in my short time. We were the gayest parliament in the world. And in Scotland, at that point, we had 3 gay leaders, gay or lesbian leaders. And that felt pretty unique, actually. So, yeah, I mean, the truth is that I came out with the huge privilege and influence and protection of being a parliamentarian. I don't know how it would have been. I was so scared about it. So when I worked in the Northeast initially in politics, I signed up. I remember signing up for what was then Gaydar. People will remember that website. And I probably identified as bisexual, and I did, and put my profile up. And then a woman that I knew in the sort of rural area of Fraserburgh contacted me and was just a supportive message. Oh, that's fantastic. Good on you, and I was like, oh my God, I'm going to be outed and I'm going to lose my job. And I'm straight back in the closet and deleted my profile. And I think about that. And it's really sad because I had an opportunity then to explore it and I didn't because I was so scared. And I think in some ways that was a manufactured, imagined fear in my own head because my family and friends were really supportive, but it was there nonetheless. And I would have been 24 or 25 at that point. We're talking 6 or 7 years later before I finally came to terms with it. And yeah, the truth is, I have a lot of privilege and protection because I'm a parliamentarian. And I'm really conscious of that people in other walks of life don't have that. And I had a girl on my team who, when I worked in the energy industry, who was very open and proud lesbian. And the abuse she got and the stuff I had to challenge amongst some of the guys in the company we worked for was just appalling. And it just went unnoticed and joked about. And it created a really toxic atmosphere.
Yeah, I think it's easy to forget that when you're in a more privileged position, isn't it? And you are out just to kind of give yourself the forgiveness about the fear that you had in coming out, because you forget that environment and how toxic that can kind of feel all around you. I certainly, remember Gaydar, that horrendous shade of orange. I don't think is something I will ever forget. But I mean, you talked a little bit about coming out there. I mean, do you obviously coming out is something as leaders and, just as gay, bi, lesbian, trans individuals, we have to do all the time.
Somebody said that to me, actually. They said, well, congratulations, but be prepared to come out, every day, every week, And it's true. I now preempt or just presuppose, my conversations with people. If I'm in a new situation, excuse me, and although I'm a public person and people often know who I am and that I am out, they don't always. So I just work into the conversation intentionally. Oh, my fiance, she, so that I don't even have to have that awkward conversation of somebody making an assumption. Excuse me.
Yeah, I think a lot of people we've spoken to do that. I know I do that, and it can be quite quite amusing sometimes to see the cogs turn for for 10 seconds, can't it? When you slip that in. I mean, any particular sort of coming out stories that kind of stand out for you where people have reacted particularly supportively or perhaps particularly excruciatingly to that?
Yeah, I've got one. I won't I won't name the person because they're actually quite sort of relatively famous in Scotland, but it's an older guy that I did a lot of charity work with, and we were talking about the charity and what we were going to be doing some stuff together. And I must have dropped into conversation that I had a girlfriend, and I could see the sort of surprise. And then, we just carried on the conversation. It's like, can I just go back for a second? Excuse me, sorry, I've got a frog in my throat. He said, did you say you're gay? And I was like, yes, I've got a female partner. And he was like, oh, but you're really pretty. I was just like, oh God. It's like, I don't even know where to start with this. And the thing was, this was an older guy in his 70s who, as it turned out in later conversations that we had never actually, to his knowledge, met anybody gay. Now, obviously, he had met people that were gay and that, but I had a choice at that moment to be deeply offended, which I kind of was, or try and explain to him why. And this is what I chose to do, was to say, look, I know that you think that that's a compliment, but it actually isn't, because there are a lot of, LGBTQ women who are not, who are very beautiful, and it creates a kind of commentary that only, lesbians are ugly, and I'm sure that's not what you're suggesting. He's like, oh, no. And once I took him through it step by step, and then when we were away doing the charity stuff together, he'd obviously taken a lot of time to reflect and read and think about it. And he was so apologetic at that point, but he was also then even more apologetic. And, he was shocked at his own behaviour. And I think there's not enough of those conversations at the moment, particularly around trans issues, I have to be honest, because there are genuinely people out there who want to understand. And it's a very fine line between what's intentional and unintentional. And sometimes, particularly on Twitter, you can't work that out. It is really difficult. But I had a choice to make. And maybe some people might say that was the wrong choice, and that's fine. But I felt the right thing to do was just explain to him why what he was saying was actually deeply offensive, even though he didn't intend it to be that way. But that was a subject of societal stuff. But it was very awkward. And I could have just been like, and laughed it off as well, but which I've done. I'm sure we've all done that. And we've all then reflected on it and been really angry or annoyed with ourselves, and it's a fine line. I was on the tube the other day walking somewhere, and I don't know if you've seen it, those of you who are in London or in London regularly in Green Park, there's a big long corridor and there's lots of pride posters, and they're great. And there was these two guys who had their cans of beer, and they were like, huh, and they were making increasingly aggressive and rude comments. And first I blocked it out, and then they said something really gratuitous and horrible and homophobic. And there was children around, and I turned around and I was like, pack it in, that's out of order. What the, swearing and all the rest of it. And what's it to you? And I was like, well, I'm a lesbian and I find that deeply offensive. And of course, then I got a load of personal abuse. And it was like, there was a personal safety thing there. They didn't know who I was, so, but that's neither here nor there in that respect. We have to often make choices in the moment, and that can be really difficult.
Yeah, it is a challenge that is not discussed that often, and I think, I too can feel guilt sometimes for, where I don't feel I have the kind of emotional resources to kind of step up and challenge things sometimes and let them slide. And I think it comes down to that, doesn't it? It's about particularly for people who are kind of dealing with some of these issues, more actively, that they might not have the resources to kind of step up and challenge that. But it's always good when you can call it what it is, isn't it? I mean, speaking about that, you mentioned a couple of times about trans people and the sort of extra disadvantages and difficulties that they're facing right now. You know, obviously a lot has shifted in favour of LGBT people in the last few years, you know, here in the UK, around the world as well. You know, what do you think the challenges are right now? And, you know, particularly for perhaps for younger people kind of growing up. I find it fascinating. There is such a different, you know, I was in school during Section 28, you know, it's a very different experience now when I talk to young LGBT people. What do you think some of the challenges today are?
I mean, I think there's a number, and in some ways, you know, the Me Too and Time's Up movement has faced a backlash, and it feels like exactly the same thing is happening in terms of trans rights. And, you know, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, however you want to look at it. There's no doubt that, you know, right-wing Christian organisations in the US are funding a lot of this, and a lot of people just I don't think we're as alive to it in the UK as perhaps other parts of the world, particularly Europe, where there's been a lot of work done on getting under the skin of the funding of certain organisations and the heavy lobbying. I think there's a big generational divide as well, to be honest. You're right. You know, I mean, we've got LGBT inclusive education now in Scotland, and you know, being rolled, well, it had been being rolled out across, you know, England and Wales as well. I think there's a bit of a disparity there. But I think just because of all sorts of things, social media and media, you know, today's school children are growing up, and these are just things that are not an issue for them, you know. They will be, depending on how they're brought up and the kind of education both at home and in school that they'll have. And that's why we need to make sure that both our workplaces, our schools, our institutions are as inclusive as possible. But I think we're facing from some very powerful sources, you know, a real backlash, is that the right word? But a real concerted effort to thwart, you know, the rights of trans people, and also a conflation. You know, the Gender Recognition Act, Gender Reform Act is you know, is a very minor piece of legislation that's been conflated with a whole load of other issues, and the same rhetoric that was used against gay, lesbian and bisexual people now being used against trans people. But also, I think there was a vacuum. I think I can recognise that in terms of Scotland, but also, you know, across the UK, you know, various consultations being done, there not being enough information and engagement positively. And when you create a vacuum and it gets filled with fear and misinformation, which is what's happening, you know, there's absolutely no doubt about that. Is really not a good place to be. And then I think on top of that, I think we're in a place at the moment where people on a lot of issues are very pitted against each other and in their own corners. Now, I think in the UK, that is being fueled by the UK government. You know, they're very happy to see people pitted against each other on all sorts of issues, whether that's immigration, whether that's, you know, even things like housing, you know, and they're all tied in together. Folk are fighting with each other rather than paying attention to what the government are doing to them. And that is also, you know, not a good place to be in. And social media fuels quite a lot of that. And I think Twitter particularly has just become a really toxic place, and not somewhere where I think we're going to win any arguments, actually. And then add on top of that the pandemic, where people have only been really existing in online spaces and not speaking to each other face to face.
Yeah, it's you know, when you sort of lay it out like that, it's a really kind of heady mix, isn't it, of factors. Yeah, I mean, on that, you know, obviously one area where legislation seems to be stalling, yeah, I believe there's a consultation going on at the moment, is around conversion therapy, which is something I believe the current government is committed to ban in its manifesto, but now is sort of running this consultation that seems to sort of never be concluding. Could you give us an insight into that? What do you think's behind that kind of, I suppose, the approach to consult, and also the approach to kind of not prioritise that or not really take it forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was big words and statements made, and then it feels like from a UK government perspective, so and it's a complex area of policy and law, and I will not pretend to understand all of the details. What I do know is that, in Scotland, actually, I think as we speak, there is evidence being taken, and there's been evidence being taken in the Scottish Parliament about the impact on people. In fact, a young person I know who, when I spoke in the debate about it, had contacted me to say, look, I'm a survivor of it. And they gave me some of their own experience, which I used anonymously. And yesterday they contacted me to say, look, if I hadn't been encouraged by what you did, I wouldn't be giving evidence. And they sent me their evidence, it's a very tough read. But to the specific stuff on policy, I mean, in the debate, I don't know how many of you watched that. We had a debate in Westminster Hall when we were still under sort of relative lockdown, and the minister gave a really rotten response. And it feels to me like there are some very powerful forces. I mean, I've seen some of the letters. I don't think I've received one, but I think other members have, basically advocating for religious organisations being allowed to continue. And I mean, it's totally not on. And so, there's a big lobby of LGBTQ parliamentarians who are almost all of us in the same place on this. So, there's a lot going on behind the scenes in terms of pressure, both in the Commons and the Lords. But it does feel very much like the can's being kicked down the road. And it's a classic move by this government. We'll do another consultation to push it down, further along the road. And so, we're putting as much pressure on as possible. But, the Conservatives have an 80 majority. There's a reality to that, but they have a big LGBTQ plus group within the Conservatives, so we're very reliant on them putting pressure on their own colleagues.
Yeah, and I guess it's whether they're sort of how much noise they're willing to make, or how much they're willing to kind of risk currying favour, isn't it? As to that really decides whether this kind of abhorrent practice will continue in the UK or not. I know you've been working to kind of push these matters forward yourself in Parliament as well, and I think you're setting up an All Party Parliamentary Group, an APPG. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I mean, I have a lot of friends who are still in the media, and obviously, it's an area that I worked in myself, and have had a lot of discussions with people about, I think particularly, lesbian representation and LGBTQ plus women in the media, because we are grossly underrepresented. I think, so I've got some stats here. There was a 2018 Ofcom report on representation and portrayal on BBC television, where people's sexuality was portrayed in a programme, and only 2% of women shown on BBC One or Two were lesbians. Same report stated that on both BBC channels, gay and bisexual men outnumbered lesbians and bisexual women by a ratio of almost 5-1. Now, that's not to pit us against each other, it's just the facts. So we decided that we wanted to set up an all-party group on LGBTQ plus women in the media and entertainment industry. So we had our first meeting. We haven't managed to formally constitute because we were actually, our meeting was in a recess in this silly Westminster parliamentary rules. But if anybody's interested in getting involved in that, I'd love to hear from you. And we hope to really get pushing on that kind of pre-Christmas. And for those who aren't aware, all party parliamentary groups they're informal within Parliament. They don't have any kind of legislative role as such, but they are an opportunity for folk from across the parliamentary spectrum to come together, to table for debates, to lobby government, to campaign on issues, to do broader engagement with communities and with particular sectors. So that's what it's really about, is so data on, right, okay, what is the representation, how bad is it? And then what can we do? What support do certain sectors of the media and entertainment industries need, and how can we work with them to make it more inclusive?
Great. So yeah, great invite there from Hannah to get in touch if that's something you're interested or passionate about, to help push that forward. It's a really important, representation is really where kind of everything starts, I think, in terms of the progress that we can make politically and societally. So yeah, fantastic to hear that that's going on. Of course, all of your experiences in Parliament haven't been positive. Whilst it sounds like a vast amount of them have, and I know that you've actually experienced homophobia in Parliament and a kind of backlash around that. Is that something you'd be open to telling us a little bit about? Because I suppose as leaders, we're all very, we're all very fearful, aren't we? In terms of coming out, in terms of being open, there's always that fear that, oh, we're going to experience this abuse. Things are going to happen in the media, etc. And to an extent, you've kind of lived through that, and it'd be fascinating to hear what that was like.
In terms of the Lord McGuinness stuff. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and it's not an end either. And actually, I need to chase up the Commissioner's office. And the main reason I haven't done that is, to be honest, because of the death of Sir David Amos. And that's probably a strange thing to say, but I think there has been so much awfulness in aspects of her job. I couldn't bear to kind of engage with it until I don't know how you get your head around another colleague being murdered. It's incredibly hard, but the long and short of what happened with Lord McGuinness was I challenged him on his behaviour towards a member of the security staff. He wasn't wearing his badge. He was being very rude and aggressive, and bearing in mind not that long ago, one of our police officers was killed on duty protecting us. I mean, the least we can do as members is wear our blooming security badges. So that then escalated because, and talking about calling people out, I mean, I felt duty bound to stand up in Parliament and name them, which you're not really supposed to do. And it's quite interesting because one of the senior members of staff in the Commons who looks after procedure, I had a meeting with, and I did say, I acknowledged that. I said, look, I know the convention is you give the member notice and you give this, and you're not supposed to name anybody. But I would have then, by implication, included the whole of the House of Lords, and it could have been anybody. So I thought, well, no, I'm not going to do that because it was one individual, and I will name and shame him because that's what we should be doing. And that then led to a series of events, which included him being contacted by a journalist. And when he spoke to that journalist, he made a homophobic slur. And the police investigated that. I mean, the Speaker was very upset about it. He contacted me personally, was very supportive. And it was quite funny because the person from the House Authorities said to me when I said, like, I know I kind of broke the rules. And he was like, yeah, but it worked. So, we have to recognise that there are all sorts of arcane and archaic rules, and sometimes they need to be broken to do the right thing, But it then turned into a full-scale investigation, which uncovered other horrific behaviour. And I then had lots of members of staff coming to me saying, he gets really drunk, he's really horrible to us. This has been going on for years and nothing had been done. And I was like, and up until that point, and until very recently, there was no way of getting rid of members of the House of Lords if they behaved inappropriately or broke the rules, because they're not elected, they're appointed. So people have gone to jail for very, very bad things and been members of the House of Lords and come out and just gone straight back in, which is just unbelievable. So there was a full investigation, which included others, including myself, and that report is now in the public domain, and it makes for pretty sickening reading. Not just what he's done, but his attitude to his behaviour. And he was given a certain period of time to do remedial training. So it seems like a bit of a, but everybody deserves the right to be reformed. But my understanding is he hasn't engaged, and if he is removed from the Lords, that will be the first time in history that has ever happened. But I had people in Northern Ireland contact me saying, he doesn't speak for us, he doesn't represent us, he's been horrible to women and LGBT people for decades. This is somebody who's systematically abused people in and out of, elected office. So, but off the back of that, I got a couple of death threats, which were things I had never had before. One that was, handwritten, and I think that was a threshold for me being crossed. And I think because of that, and because of what had happened recently to Sir David, it just, I'm yet to find out the final outcome, and it'll be forthcoming. And I don't regret doing it, but I have had moments where it's been pretty horrible and difficult to deal with, and a massive distraction from my job.
Yeah, it must be hugely anxiety-inducing as well, knowing that potentially when the outcome is announced, that's going to kind of kick this up in the media again, and potentially result in more of that, particularly as you say in the context of the killings of some of your colleagues, which I can't imagine the anxiety that comes with that. I mean, you talked about going into politics to find that sense of safety, and it must be pretty difficult when you do that, and yet you still experience even there somewhere you would believe would be particularly kind of safe and progressive environment, that kind of treatment. And I know it's something that many people in the network have struggled with, having to kind of network or work with colleagues who are overtly or indirectly homophobic. As leaders, what do you think we can do? We're a group of leaders here in various sectors. On the call, I can see we've got CEOs of charities, directors of large departments at multinational firms. We've got managing directors of companies, founders of companies. What do you think we could be kind of doing more of to support what you're trying to achieve, and to support progress for LGBT plus people generally, do you think?
Very easy question, Matt. And I feel honoured to be in such esteemed company. And I think it's important also to say that, for me, I stood to serve. Ultimately, that's why you stand for election. Like all of you will be doing in your roles and day-to-day jobs. You're there to create or to serve or to support. And it's a really tough one. And I think one of the things is the atmosphere at the moment. Be under no illusions that the attack on trans rights and the rights of trans and non-binary people, there is a creep. There is definitely a mission creep into broader LGBTQ issues, and we have to be very, very alive to that. I see I feel it myself, that I'm scared sometimes to tweet about certain things or talk about certain things, and it's how we have those conversations. And I think probably the example that I used earlier, is a good one, in the sense that sometimes people say and do things without thinking and without even realizing. And it's about how you have those conversations with people. And sometimes it needs a much more bold challenge. But sometimes it's about putting it in the context. And I think particularly in business, or the third and charity sectors, is explaining to people who perhaps don't understand, and did grow up in in a generation where being gay was still criminalized, or during the Section 28 era of there are a lot of LGBTQ plus people. You will have them in your family, you will have them in your community, and we are valued and valuable to you as a business. We are people who earn money, who spend money, and every organisation will be all the better for having different perspectives in it. And these things can quite easily be put into hard numbers, and sometimes that's the language that you need to speak to people in. It feels a bit cynical, but it's the same with politics. Certain issues that had never been discussed in politics until women finally got the vote or got to Parliament. And you listen to any of the kind of early, Angela Eagle, who was the first gay woman in Parliament, or Harriet Harman, who's been on women's issues particularly, there for such a long time. Things had never been raised or even thought about or considered until those voices and perspectives had been raised. So what we can do as leaders is have those conversations with the people in our business about just how we support each other and how we're inclusive, because you might have people in your business or organisation that aren't a member of the LGBTQ plus community themselves, but their children or their family members might be. And I think the last thing I saw study done of, I think it was under 25s, but I might be wrong, it was at least 1 in 4 young people identify as being not straight, so, and that's not an experimentation thing. That's just a realization that for a lot of people, both gender and sexuality come on a spectrum. And that is the society. Now that's happening whether people like it or not. So it's like, you either get on board or you get out of the way. Your business or organization either adapts to that. Because if you're selling or promoting or recruiting, the young people of today don't want an organisation that's going to make them feel like they're outsiders. They'll go elsewhere, or they'll start their own, company or enterprise. the world is just a very, very different place, and they are much more inclusive just by nature, because the media they consume is different, and the society that they are creating for themselves is very different. So I think it is about, but I also recognise that having those conversations can be difficult and challenging for people if they don't, like when I first came out, I had rejected so much of LGBT culture because I was scared. And so and it can, it can be, don't say difficult to navigate, but for people who haven't engaged, there can be a lot to learn. And if you're a leader in an organisation and you're feeling a bit lost, and I think there's a lot of good intention there. And I think sometimes as a community, we can be a wee bit judgy. We can be a wee bit, and that comes from, being discriminated against sometimes. You get fed up of it and you just want people to understand. But, my mum often says to me, people are on a journey about some of this stuff. And, you need to help them on that journey rather than make them feel alienated because they didn't get it right. And I do think there's a lot to be said for that.
Yeah, it is challenging, isn't it, to separate that sometimes, and put that work into kind of understanding, explaining, provoking, and supporting dialogue rather than this very combative sort of discursive environment that we see particularly on social media, which, as you say, is a kind of side effect of being discriminated against, and can create quite a vicious circle. I'm going to hand over to Claire now, just to see if we've got any questions from the chat, or if Claire has anything you want to ask, perhaps. So, Claire, are you with us? Hi.
No, this is absolutely awesome. Thank you so much. We did have a question from Mercy about what you think we should do as leaders, but I think you've covered that with bells on, so we won't go into that again. But I did want to bring you back to the story that you talked about your younger colleague in the energy industry, and I'm aware it might have been a little while ago now, but that sounds like a particularly vicious situation that you found yourself in.
Yeah,
using that as the example, like if we were in those kinds of situations, or if we could observe that kind of toxic culture from the outside, how can we fix it? How can we influence? So, there are certain industries that are quite key to our future as a country. I would suggest the energy industry is one of them. The idea that we lose our young people into that kind of despair, I just find that quite strong. So what do you think we could do?
I think it's multifaceted, and in the end up, I challenged that culture in a number of ways, and I think made improvements through a lot of different programs, and some of the stuff that I talked about trying to explain to the executive team, look, you're going to do better as a company. I was brought on board in that job because they had a problem with retention, and this was at the time when the oil and gas industry was at its height. So turnover was big, partly driven because of finances, but a lot of younger people coming into the company wanted a much more broad experience of different activities, and they didn't necessarily want more money. So just trying to fight for a half day on a Friday was like, the CEO was just very, very traditional, and it was him who I spoke about publicly when I broke my non-disclosure agreement. Who talked about not wanting to have a Christmas party as one company because he didn't like the way the women in that, and he was Dutch, and that's no comment on Dutch people, because the vast majority of Dutch people I worked with were incredible, but he was just a particular character, and he made it out as if it was, well, I've come to this country and the women dress in a certain way and I don't want to see that at my Christmas party. And I was so horrified by that. I challenged it with others then in the room, and he still made the same comment, and eventually I couldn't cope with it anymore. But I think in those scenarios, depending on the roles that we're in, I think it is about putting it to the leadership of an organisation with hard facts around how much better inclusive companies do. But also, we had things like lunch and learns, and I tried to bring in people from different walks of life to talk about culture in different organisations. But when you've got the person at the top of the company behaving like that, it was really, really difficult. And eventually I just felt I had to call it out. And I can only hope that by doing that, and I went on Channel 4 News and I parroted exactly the words that he had said to me. I can only hope on some level he saw that and thought, okay, I've done the wrong thing and I need to change my behaviour. I mean, that's a pretty extreme example. I'm trying to be as practical as possible here though. But, you know, a lot of the charities and organisations in the LGBTQ sector have really great programs, and they will facilitate people to come into your organisation and talk to you about your processes, what you can do, how you can, you know, so you don't necessarily have to do it all yourself, but you can, you know, break it down into different parts of the business that might be facing challenges. But it's also about, you know, just saying, look, things like X and Y are just completely unacceptable. And I think we have moved on societally, but it's the subtle stuff, it's the more discreet discrimination that can be really, really hard to challenge.
I know we're going to break out into little groups in a minute, but I've got a couple more things. You invited us to participate in an All Party Parliamentary Group. If you could put into the chat or some way of us getting involved in that, anybody?
Yeah, I will just put I'll put my parliamentary email in, and that is the best way to contact me.
That's great. And I mean, another thing that you sort of dwelt on there was, you know, you talked about being in a position of privilege as an MP, but you're also in a position where you're receiving death threats. And I feel like we, as leaders across whatever it is we do, we are all in positions of privilege as well, but we're not receiving death threats. So what more could we be doing? I feel like we should be lobbying our MPs more. What would you suggest that we would write to our MPs on?
Do you mean in terms of engaging on these issues, or do you?
To support our community more, I feel like we are in a position of privilege, and maybe our voice is less controversial than yours, because certainly, you know, I've never even received a negative tweet about putting this LGBT directors thing on Twitter. So that's very different from the position you're in. So what could we do?
I mean, I think lobbying government, particularly on, you know, the current the issues of the day at the moment in terms of our community are, you know, trans rights, so Gender Reform Act, and you know, conversion therapy from a UK perspective, and same from a Scottish perspective. And the truth is that so often, you know, business leaders, leaders of charities and organisations like yours have a really, really influential voice. And I understand that sometimes it's scary to use that, because there can be concern about your business being seen in a certain light. But sometimes I think one of the really powerful things that I've seen in recent times, and I've, you know, done them myself in the early days of my time in politics, is joint letters. So where a group of leaders come together and put their name to a letter that says, you know, we believe as a group of leaders that the government needs to act on X and Y, or needs to do X and Y. And I think probably there's more I can do as parliamentarian as well, in terms of, you know, gathering people like yourself together. But that's probably something that we could do together collectively, is put your names to a letter that says, and, you know, publish that, you know, in a newspaper, and make that very, very public, because there's also strength in collectivism as well. You know, it's less scary than necessarily doing something individually. But I think as we navigate our way through both the conversion therapy and the trans rights issues, they are the kind of two areas at the moment that are very, you know, at the forefront of media criticism and discussion. You know, and putting pressure on. I mean, I'd like to say that I want to believe that those in the UK government will listen. They seem sadly immune a lot of the time to kind of, but then also, you know, individually lobbying MPs, you know, and it could be the MP in your constituency asking them, well, what are you doing on this issue? What's your position? Because there's nothing more scary than when a business in your area is like, right, why have you not done this? Or what are you doing on this? You know, and individual pressure can be very powerful too. But they are the kind of things that I think as a group of leaders, that you can be, you know, hosting events where you invite parliamentarians who are not on the same page to come and speak to you. you know, and saying, right, come and talk to us about your views. Why do you hold these views? How do you think these are going to help us as a society? You know, and perhaps some, you know, some engagement as well. Because if those parliamentarians who are not minded to support those rights are, you know, faced with debate and discussion, you know, they might change their mind.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I'm speaking on behalf of this group without consulting anybody, but if there's any way that we can support you, Hannah, in anything that you're doing, then I would like to say on behalf of this group that we will get behind you, and we will orchestrate, Matt and I will orchestrate trying to get signatures and things like that to help you with anything.
Thank you. I really appreciate that, and I will give it some further thought as well, because it's not something that just I want to just react off the top of my head. I think as we go through, you know, the coming months and years of these issues, then your influence and power will be hugely important, and we want to mobilise that in the best possible way. So, and same, let me make that offer right back to you, that if there are particular issues that you're facing within your businesses or as individuals, and there's ever anything that I can do or my parliamentary colleagues can do, then please know that my door is always open, and I'm happy to speak to folk individually as well.
Thank you, that's brilliant. I'm going to put my email address into this chat in case there's people on this group who especially want to talk to me about what more we could be doing as well. So I'm going to do that, but I'm aware that we need to break out now and have a bit of a conversation, Matt.
Yeah, that's right. So yeah, before we do that, I just want to say from me and Claire, and on behalf of the network, a massive thank you, Hannah, for taking the time out of your no doubt incredibly busy schedule to come and chat to us today. It's been really, really fascinating, and yeah, I'm absolutely sure the network will get behind you in terms of what you're doing with the APPG and whatever else. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been a huge pleasure, and hope to be in touch with you all and speak to you all again.
Thanks.